James Egan Holmes, case number 12 CR 1522. The record should reflect that Mr. Holmes is present with his attorneys and the prosecutors are present as well. We're outside the presence of the jury. Dr. Gurr is back on the witness stand. Doctor, there are a lot of questions from the jury. When the jury comes back in, I'm going to ask you the questions. I know that you're trying to make a flight tonight, so I'm going to ask you to answer the questions that are asked, okay?
Yes.
All right. Okay, let's bring the jury in, please. Please be seated. The record should reflect that the jury is back in the courtroom. Members of the jury, welcome back. Thank you for your patience. There are a lot of questions that you have submitted for Dr. Gurr. Before I ask Dr. Gurr the questions, I have a question for all of you, and I just need you to answer it by a show of hands. Did two of you, by chance, submit questions on the same form? No. Okay. No, for the record, nobody raised his or her hand. Thank you. Please don't infer anything into why I asked the question, all right? Don't speculate as to why I asked the question and don't infer anything from my question. All right, Dr. Gurr, the jury has submitted some questions, and based on the rules of evidence and other applicable rules of law, I have determined that most of them are appropriate. The first question is, how do you know what you inquired about but did not document? Do you have a list of questions that you intended to ask Mr. Holmes? That's a two-part question. So let me repeat the first part and have you answer that. How do you know what you inquired about but did not document?
I know from a report, and I know from the notes that I took during or immediately after, and primarily, but I remember from many of the documents that I reviewed over time, some of them several times, I remember the details that were provided.
The next question is, do you have a list of questions that you intended to ask Mr. Holmes?
Yes. The list of questions related to the way that the report is structured that I refer to as a timeline, starting with the background, where he was born, going year by year, kindergarten, lower school, the neighborhood that he grew up in, the move, what he will do, what he likes to eat. These are routine questions that I ask every person clinically that I evaluate. Hobbies, preferences, this is in the background section. Then in the academic history, I go over classes, subject matter, teachers remembered, what was the topic. These are the routine things, one after another. In the social history, starting from friendships, what did you do with your friend, who called, who visited, who came to your home. This is like routine. And for the psychiatric history, probing for presentation of any symptoms that are child appropriate from a lifespan perspective, attention deficit, anxiety that are more common in children. As we go into adolescent, oppositional defiant behavior. As we go into adolescent, presentation when depression is more likely to emerge, substance use, psychotic symptoms. These are standard questions that I go through, and it is based on a structured interview that I've conducted many times and is applied to every participant. And then it includes also any help-seeking behavior, or that parents were looking counseling, seeing a mental health professional, a counselor, activities, playing soccer, any activity that gives me information on the person, and reviewing appropriate medical records that relate to each segment in the development.
The next question, Doctor, is, since there is no video or audio of your interviews with Mr. Holmes, is it possible that you suggested answers but do not recall?
I did not suggest answer to Mr. Holmes.
The next question is, since Mr. Holmes did not show neurocognitive deficits across the board, is this a contraindication of schizophrenia?
No, it is not, because high-functioning individuals, which are a small portion of people with schizophrenia, because they're a small portion of the population, and I mean 2-3 standard deviation from the mean. It's rare. Most people are within the mean. Most of us are within the mean. To have this level of cognitive abilities is well higher than the mean, and the follow-up, so in the neuropsychological evaluation, is concomitant with IQ. It is highly correlated with IQ. Important in people like that is variability, and there was variability in his performance. Furthermore, the follow-up evaluation showed decline in IQ, commonly seen and documented in people with schizophrenia.
The next question is, as a doctor, what are the effects of Vicodin, if you know?
Yeah, it's for pain, so it's a pain medication.
The next question is, you mentioned that schizophrenia has an onset period of 2 to 3 years. Do you find the fact that Mr. Holmes had delusions of murder for at least 10 years prior to the murders a contraindication of schizophrenia as a diagnosis?
No, I do not. I said that the common, and when we talk about common, it's always a range. And commonly when people come to an academic center across the United States, multiple studies, each 2 to 3 years, is it possible that the parents will become concerned in a teenager or young adult after 1 year? It's possible. Is it possible that it will go undetected for many years and a person coping and gradually decompensating? Absolutely.
The next question is, what was Dr. Mel Lepsey's diagnosis that you referred to regarding Mr. Holmes?
I think that I recall that it was, but I have to check, that it was a adjustment disorder, but I will have to check more. I think it was adjustment disorder.
The next question is, did you ask Mr. Holmes about why he went to such elaborate means via his gear at the movie theater to protect himself if there's no meaning to life? For example, helmet, neck guard, leg protectors, excuse me.
Yes. No meaning to life was part of his delusion, and I've asked him repeatedly, Why didn't you kill yourself if there's no meaning to life? He was afraid to die.
The next question is, did Mr. Holmes discuss with you why he chose to commit the murders at the Batman movie? Did his decision have anything to do with the content of that movie?
Chaos is in my notes over the notebook. When I went over the notebook with him, the movie is on chaos and his perception of the universe and his status was it is in chaos.
The next question is it possible that antipsychotic medications could change the size of the ventricles of a person's brain even slightly, if you know?
There is a large literature, I'll say it briefly, there's a large literature, isn't it? And it is a debated topic in the field. To do that, you need longitudinal studies.
The next question, when you reviewed information from the counselor who walked to the park with Mr. Holmes as a child, in your diagnosis of Mr. Holmes, did you consider oppositional defiance disorder or autism spectrum disorder? Why or why not? What made you rule out autism spectrum disorder, narcissism, or a defiance type disorder?
For oppositional defiant behavior, it was based on an evaluation one time based on some difficulties at home, and looking at the record, my evaluation consisted of a quick change that the parents and guidance to the parents of dealing with a firstborn that they might not listen as much and increasing communication between them. There was no evidence of any oppositional defiant behavior later on. When seen at age 8, a diagnosis needs to be made in the record for insurance purposes. It has to be made, and this was the best that fit the complaint or the reason the parents looked for help.
Go ahead.
For autism, I considered it, and as I referred to in my written note after the first evaluation, it was a consideration to get more of a developmental history, and this was a question, one of the questions that I provided the attorneys, investigators who went out to meet with his parents regarding the language. That's how I knew about the language, and the grandmother information that I provided to the court. There is overlap, especially in males, higher proportion of males with autism and with schizophrenia. You see it in all neurodevelopmental disorders. And there is an overlap in the features. Autism starts much earlier, is associated with significant motor, language, and social interaction deficit. It did not have significant difficulties in articulation, in being clear, in not being engaged with activities that you might see in autism. So I did not think, and his motor behavior, so I did not think, or abnormal like I showed, like echolalia and repeated movement, I did not think that he met criteria for autism spectrum disorder. But autistic features, especially in males with negative symptoms of schizophrenia, are present.
The next question is, did you discuss with Mr. Holmes with respect to his notebook what he meant by a dark night rises? Did he indicate to you that he was the dark night that was finally rising?
I discussed it with him. He was not the dark night that was finally rising, but it was more the chaos that led to the selection of the movie, the specific movie, and that things are changing, but he did not see himself as the Dark Knight.
The next question is, given your testimony regarding your interest in an experience in schizophrenia, did you consider any other potential diagnosis for Mr. Holmes? If so, which one?
Yes, I considered autism as a potential diagnosis, and I considered major depression with psychotic features as a potential diagnosis, but looking at the lifespan perspective, all the information, the presentation was most consistent with schizophrenia spectrum disorder, among that schizophrenia.
On what basis did you rule out other diagnoses?
On the basis of the information that I obtained and reviewed and the hours that I spent with Mr. Holmes, why depression was reported, it was not the extent of it, the proportion of time that he felt incapacitated by depression did not warrant a diagnosis of major depression with psychotic features. It was more the delusions that took over, and the bizarre delusions in nature that are not as common in major depression. But he was depressed, and I did consider schizoaffective disorder, but believe that this was not the most prominent features in his behavior.
You may have answered this question already, but I'll read the question anyhow. The question is, could some of the 5 domains of schizophrenia spectrum disorder also be included in other disorders? For example, disorganized thinking.
Yes. Can be major depression with psychotic features, might have some disorganized thinking during exacerbation of psychosis. You can see it in more, older people with dementia, but most prominent it will be in schizophrenia.
The DSM-5, as shown to the jury, says that schizotypal disorder is a personality disorder. What does that mean?
People can carry behavioral features that are part of the personality that are long-standing and this is who they are. So this is considered more of an axis 2, a second level. I did consider schizotypal personality disorder, but as I pointed out in my report is that the features did fit better schizophrenia, and at times, as documented in the DSM-5, if there are previous features that are consistent with personality, you can have schizophrenia and schizotypal personality disorder. But the schizophrenia will be first, and that's on top of the ongoing features.
The next question is, because Mr. Holmes always had anxiety regarding oral communications with other people and never had issues of cognition and drugs or alcohol, doesn't that seem inconsistent with a typical case of onset of schizophrenia?
Anxiety, people with schizophrenia across age group, before the onset of the psychosis process emerge, it's characterized by high level of anxiety. So the fact that Mr. Holmes has experienced it at a young age made him more vulnerable and likely to have a more severe illness than somebody who was relatively well adjusted, was communicating and had friends, will have a milder form of illness. When multiple factors coalesce, like in any other disorder in the body, the brain is hit more severely.
The next question is, could Mr. Holmes be manipulative regarding the call for action?
I do not believe that he was manipulative. He used similar words of floodgates opening, I needed to do that, mission with me and with other professionals. Call for action, if you Google call for action, you will see that there are about, in quote, There are about 30,000 references in Google for call for action. It is common. It's used commonly. I did not tell Mr. Holmes to use call for action because it was the last chapter in my book, Call for Action for Mental Health, to the public. Let's do something about it. I did not use it.
Are there any tests shown to show a level of manipulation in a person or client, if you know?
Yes, you can check on my lingering as part of the personality evaluation, and when he was checked repeatedly, there was no evidence of malingering by the psychologist who evaluated him.
If he was capable of manipulating, is there a way to know when he was being manipulative?
I will use manipulative here in the extent of not revealing all the information and not lying. There were times, and I repeatedly said it in my report and in the presentation here, that it was very guarded. It was like pulling teeth. This was why part of why I repeatedly saw him. If you'd have been, eloquent and just saying one thing after another, it would have been relatively easy. But I did not see evidence for manipulation. I asked the questions in different ways and repeatedly, and in looking over my note, it was consistent. And when looking at other reports, it was consistent. I did not learn anything new. So I will say guarded, and at times maybe difficult to say, to let me know how sick he was.
What states are you licensed in?
Pennsylvania. I was trained in Pennsylvania and lived in Pennsylvania throughout my professional life.
Does having a mental illness make a person insane?
No.
As a person progresses in their mental illness, does that change?
It will depend. Some people progress in the mental illness and remain totally sane and able to function or live in the community without support, sometimes with support, but they're totally sane.
As a mental health clinician, isn't it important to document everything in case you are not able to testify?
I'm not sure if something precludes me from testifying, like I'm ill or what. If this would have come up, for example, it's a good question. If this would have come up and I'd have made every effort to come, but if this would have come up, I'd have provided maybe more explanation of my notes and would have asked the defense to have somebody else evaluate Mr. Holmes in addition to me, because people can get sick.
The next question is, wouldn't documenting help you defend or support your opinion? And then the juror says, I don't know if defend is the right word, maybe support is better.
I don't think so. I think that, when the whole thing is done, sort of at the end of the day, and you ask me if I'd have had to do it again to obtain the information, I'd have done it the same way. And that's how I've practiced clinically, by obtaining the information, integrating it, and providing it in the best way that I can. I mean, if there would have been more time, I could have been sitting for hours. And, as I said, writing down all the notes, and he said, and I said. But I don't think that videotaping, my perception, my clinical, that if I would have come to the first interview and have begun to videotape him, I would have not been able to get the same information. It depends on the status of the person. Clinically, we do not interview people at the first time that we meet them.
The next question is, besides the resolution on the MRI, is there any other difference?
No.
The next question is, with your experience, wouldn't you want to see the progression and the disease? Wouldn't you want to get a baseline so that you can see if there is change?
In relationship to the MRI, yeah, and we are doing it in research, but most people do not get an MRI unless there's a clinical indication. And if, so yeah, it would have been helpful if an MRI would have been obtained years back and now repeated, the same way that the neuropsychological. I did not see a reason. An MRI is not diagnostic. I did not see a reason to obtain an MRI early on until I got a hold of the CT scan and saw slight dilatation of the ventricle. And I saw the decline in his cognitive measure and was wondering what else is going on in his brain.
Just because someone has a serious mental illness, does that mean that he is insane?
No.
How do you know that he was compliant with the medications prior to the shooting, or do you know?
I do know that there were several pills that were left that he did have, I believe. I'm not sure about the number, maybe 4 or 5, that he did not take. But I cannot tell. The medications that he was taking were not antipsychotic medications. So he never had antipsychotic medications. And the medications, as he reported, reduced his level of anxiety, made him feel better, did not change the content of his delusions.
During the beginning of questioning, you had to refer to your notes and report quite often. Wouldn't taking more notes during your interviews better assist you when you have to testify?
I referred to my notes in order to refresh my memory when asked specific questions. When did you get this document? Or did you see this document? And I've seen so many documents that at times I had to look at the dates, and I've prepared for myself a table with dates that I kept track of. When did I get it? When did I review it? So that I have a log of activities. But I do not believe that if I would have been writing another multiple pages and reading them, the result, the conclusion would have been any different.
The next question is, the fact that Mr. Holmes had been recovering from mono, what effect could the illness have on his mental health, if you know?
When Mr. Holmes went home in December of 2011, he was fatigued, he had a temperature, and he saw a physician and was diagnosed with mono. He improved at home to the point that the family did a family trip to Arizona. He saw Uncle Dexter, he enjoyed it, and by the time he left, he felt rejuvenated. So, fatigue, feeling run down, yes, mono does not create psychosis.
The next question is, can someone who has schizophrenia appear normal to others, even friends and family?
It depends on the prominent features of the disorder of schizophrenia. It depends on the level of disclosure of the discomfort that somebody might feel. Somebody might feel anxious or doesn't sleep well as a result. They might tell the parents, the family, or whoever they live with, a roommate, I don't feel as well. But when somebody is guarded, and at times when the family is away, do not live with the person, and are not that observant, most people don't know that much about schizophrenia, and they do not think schizophrenia. It's the last diagnosis that people think about. So it is possible that somebody will appear, maybe a little bit subdued, or a little bit maybe more sad, or a little bit not with it, a little bit spaced out, but will not be diagnosed. Professionals diagnose schizophrenia.
Can someone who has schizophrenia go in and out of delusional thinking?
This is one of the hardest things to change. So you can change anxiety, you can change hallucinations with antipsychotic, delusions that are fixed and elaborate and develop over a longer period of time become an essential part of the person.
The graduate school application that you referred to that indicated poor interviewing skills, etc., what school, what was the date, and do you know if Mr. Holmes was aware of the comments, if you know the answer to the question?
Let me start with the letter. He was not aware. Graduate school interviews do never provide such feedback. Faculty are professionals. They try to interact. Several faculty members, then they meet and discuss it. No, he was not aware of what they were thinking. University of Iowa, I do not remember the exact date. I believe interviews commonly take place the fall before school starts. So most schools make the decision by April, about April, spring. So people have time to move, find a room, place to live. So I believe that it was probably in 2011, but I'm not sure to the specific date.
You refer to Mr. Holmes' IQ and level of intelligence a lot. Is someone who has a lower IQ or intelligence not capable of having a severe schizophrenia or mental disease as someone who has a higher IQ and higher level of intelligence? Why is IQ so important to mental disease, if you know?
IQ, it's important for mental disease because it reflects brain capacity, the ability to have all of the domains that we went over before at the person's, tip of the finger, to be able to, continue and navigate through life. So most people with schizophrenia do not have lower IQ, as I stated, but the lowered IQ can be associated with greater difficulties in independent functioning. They require more supervision and effort on the part of family or professionals to guide their life. They are more like at the level of children that need supervision, even though they can be adults.
Would anyone who has delusions be considered insane?
No.
Do delusions control the person, or does the person control or evolve the delusions?
The delusions are part of the person, but the person doesn't sit consciously and say, well, today I have nothing better to do, so I'm going now to sit and elaborate the delusions. They take a life of their own. There's no control over them. The longer the time, the more complex, the more they become the person.
Is schizophrenia a brain disorder, an illness, or a disease?
A disease is any type of dysfunction. It can be a heart disease, it can be a GI, gastrointestinal disease. It's a general category. Brain disease covers many brain disorders. Schizophrenia is one of them.
How did you determine Mr. Holmes's verbal memory declined over time?
He had 2 evaluations that Dr. Hanlon has testified here, and they were about 2, I think less than 2 years apart, and same tests were repeated, and what you expect is with practice, perhaps some improvement, but the domain of verbal memory has declined relative to other domains, and this is what you see in people with schizophrenia. The most consistent finding is that.
You said that most people with schizophrenia do not commit crimes. What differentiates someone with schizophrenia that does commit crimes from most people who have schizophrenia who do not commit crimes?
So there's some literature on that, and people with schizophrenia who do commit crimes are more likely to be delusional and primarily delusional in nature with greater, some of them might have more difficulty in impulse control, and it depends on the type of crime. It's different between, stealing from a store because you don't have food and you don't have money, you run out the monthly allotment of money, to murder.
What is the difference between prodromal, mildly psychotic, and extremely psychotic? And how do you decide at what point the severity changes?
So prodromal, in any illness, it's the phase of the illness, early signs. So if somebody might have the flu, it doesn't hit you right like that. It can be initially that you feel a little bit run down and you just feel a little bit like not your usual self, and then it progresses. Same applies. It's a general word. It's not unique to schizophrenia. It has been adapted in schizophrenia in the field. We always look for terms that communicate among professionals. So prodromal is the phase of illness before it becomes fulminant, and there is manifestation of multiple features that are consistent with schizophrenia. The prodromal phase can take years.
All right, the next question is, if someone has one false belief one time, is that a delusion? Can delusions change or do they evolve?
To have one false belief one time where it's gone away and it was not really fully formed, such, for example, I think that I will just proceed just for going through all the questions. So somebody can have, a brief idea and it goes away. This is not a delusion. A delusion needs to be complex, incorporating multiple components. And the more serious the illness, the more severe the delusion.
The next question is, do you quantify delusions to determine severity?
I look at the extent of the delusion, the complexity of the delusion, the bizarreness of the delusion, and how it permeates the life of a person.
Is it up to each individual psychiatrist's opinion to determine how severe someone's delusions are?
Yes, psychiatrists do evaluate, patients and or clients defendants, any terms, and draw conclusions, but it will usually, if they work together and their experience and see many, many people with schizophrenia, you gain an appreciation. This is something that is not big deal. Or this is something that I've never seen before. Then it's severe. So it's just a matter of experience.
Would counsel please approach for just a moment? The next question is, what was the primary reason and evidence for you that helped you determine that Mr. Holmes was insane at the time of the crime?
He was not capable of differentiating between right or wrong. He was not capable of understanding that the people that he was going to kill wanted to live. He was not capable to consider that people are different from him. He assumed that what applies for me, at the end of the world, it will apply to everybody else. So there was inability to consider the morals that we share as healthy people did not play a role. Shocking, but did not play a role in his process of preparing himself and achieving his mission.
At what point in the process did you determine that Mr. Holmes was insane?
After the first series of interviews and review of the material that was available to me before February, before I issued the first report in February 2013, and it took me a while to write the report. I did not sit one afternoon.
The next question is, in your expert opinion, can a person who is experiencing prodromal symptoms of schizophrenic spectrum disorder have their mental illness exacerbated by committing a crime that includes murdering people?
I have to think about that because I haven't seen any person like that, fortunately. Can the experience, so this is just, I'm putting on my clinical hat without experience, because I've never seen somebody like that. I think that the experience of going through the execution, doing what was done, what Mr. Holmes has gone through, committing the act, the arrest, being in prison, can have influence on a person's on behavior. But for most people who commit a crime, the crime does not create psychosis. The psychosis is before the crime, and depending on the crime and the consequences, there might be some deterioration.
The next question is, for the MRI study that you conducted, would the MRI machine be considered the constant variable of this research? Wouldn't the difference of the machines affect the study that you conducted with his brain and the 79 others?
There are ways of pulling data together and adapting the algorithm across machines. When pulling data, one of the papers where there are multiple authors that I was referring to today, we are collecting data to see the consistency of findings across people with schizophrenia in Europe and the United States and gather thousands of people across machines. There are now methods of doing it together that are reliable.
How does the way that Dr. Reed asks questions differ from what you called probing as your way of questioning and pushing the defendant to answer or give answers?
I think that clinicians who interview people have different styles that depend on not just on their experience, but on who they are. And sometimes there are sex differences. Men can approach somebody, a patient, different than a female approaches. I wait more for the person to talk and try to push them in a way that will give me more information. I talk less, especially at the beginning. I talk less. It's not like, I think this will summarize it. I more go around and around observing the person so that I can try to get an answer for them, making sure, did you understand what I asked you? What did I ask you to repeat? Why can't you answer? What is not clear about what I asked you? Let me try and put it now a little bit differently to try to get the information from them.
Are your notes that you take during evaluations, clinical or otherwise, an important piece of documentation in your practices? And do you often rely on those notes in your practice? And do you teach your students to rely on those types of notes?
When a patient is seen clinically, you are required to have notes. Systems have changed now in the United States, including the University of Pennsylvania. It's all electronic medical records. So there's no, you document on the computer. I do not, some clinicians will do it with the patients. In our center, we do not sit in front of the patient with a computer. It creates a distance. You are not able to attend to them, to show interest. What you show is that I really want to do my job. We don't do that. We take simple notes. At times it's distracting to the patients. They'll clam up. They don't want you to write what they tell you. They're suspicious that these notes. So at times it will be done after that exactly the same way. I'm talking clinical, not research. Exactly the same way that it was done here.
Knowing that this is such a large case, why did you choose not to record your evaluations? Although your opinion is what is brought to court, do you feel that this would have supported your opinion and provided more information?
I'll say maybe briefly several points. I think that to ask the jury to look at 28.5 hours of videotape from me would have been a burden. And I considered that the information that I summarized is sufficiently strong and can be portrayed, and that I've no interest in putting anything there. My integrity and professional experience in my career are more important than this high-profile case. Nobody knows, except for my family that knows she's in Colorado now, knows about my participation in this case. And nobody will. No media, nobody. I do not talk. It's not my interest in doing that.
The next question is, the diagnosis of Mr. Holmes is within the same spectrum of mental illness between each of the evaluating doctors in this case, but the opinion of sanity varies. Can you tell us what facts regarding legal sanity you disagree with and why, compared to Dr. Reed and Dr. Metzner's opinions?
So I do not have their report in the file that I brought to the court. What I have are my notes that I have taken and my reports and my curriculum vitae. So I will partly rely on my memory and the essence of what they've said. Is that they've considered the planning that Mr. Holmes has taken, the steps that he has taken that were described well in their documentation and by the district attorney, that he has asked me all the questions that we went through yesterday in detail of, did he purchase this, did he do that, did he cover the windows of his car, to indicate that he did have the whereabouts to consider that this is something that he is doing is illegal and wrong and evil, and is called to student health, to the hotline, that he didn't stay on the line, is planned to flee, all of the details that have been gone through multiple times here as an indication. They considered that he is not insane, namely that at the time that he has committed this tragedy, he was able to do it, for whatever motivation that he has had, but he knew exactly what he was doing, and he was sitting and planning it, and maybe he was even enjoying it. I don't think so. I beg to differ.
The next question, in your opinion, if the defendant tried everything possible to stop his delusions or unwanted thoughts, then what would be the reason for turning down medication and continuing treatment if you know and if the defendant talked to you about this? In other words, you can't speculate, but you can only answer the question if you know based on what he told you.
So in Dr. Fenton's notes, and I have them in my report, antipsychotics were considered, specifically the thought between Risperdal, one antipsychotic also called risperidone, that he is currently on, and Seroquel, another antipsychotic. And she notes, in her notes, clinic notes, that Seroquel can be more sedative. So risperidone might be a better medication. Mr. Holmes did not want to take antipsychotics, and she started him on sertraline and clonopin to reduce his anxiety. The reason he conveyed to me that he did not want to take an antipsychotic, he knew antipsychotic is given to people with schizophrenia. And if I have schizophrenia, life is over. I will not be able to do graduate school and fulfill my life goal of being a neuroscientist.
The next question is, on Tuesday, you testified that you wrote 2 books saying that it's important to interview family members to get the observations prior to diagnosing schizophrenia. Then why did you testify today that interviewing his parents was irrelevant in this case?
The book that I wrote are based on general recommendations that are clinically helpful and relate to adolescents. And the effort was to give parents of young people who are early in the course of schizophrenia or prodromal and the general public information to parents. This is what it will look like. And it provides clear example that the public can read. Most young people, adolescents, live at home. You cannot see them without the parents. The parent sign, when they come into the hospital, they are the children, they are minors. Having information from parents is very important. Going to California was difficult for me and his parents to come up with the time for that. I tried to think of a time to go there and it didn't work out for me. I had information, I asked the team, I looked at movies that related to his parents, so them with him, obtained as much information as I could, and I say it was irrelevant because the information that I got from them, I knew more about Mr. Holmes than his mom or dad knew. He revealed to me, provided me with details, more than he has provided to his parents. There are times that parents do not know. And his parents are not the similarities. His parents, and I say it openly, his parents are reserved, quiet people. In some respects, he's similar to them. And this is when Dr. Fenton did not get permission for Mr. Holmes to get information from his family. She did not get permission. She was so concerned about him that she wanted to know, was he always like that? And she called Mrs. Holmes. She did not disclose to Mrs. Holmes that her son has homicidal ideation. And Mrs. Holmes she said, it's always been like that. She said, Mrs. Holmes told me, so it's not hearsay, that they're all quiet people. And many people are quiet. They are quiet people, and that was what it was. the information that I have obtained when I interviewed them was fully consistent with what I obtained from the investigators and from the pictures and the movie. They did not reveal to me iota of new information about him.
What was the deciding factor, in your opinion, that the defendant did not have the capacity to know right from wrong on July 20, 2012?
The acute level of his psychosis at that time, the belief that he must act, that there is no value to his life, other people's life, that other people share the difficulties that he shares, and that by killing them, he will incorporate value to himself.
The next question is, if disorganized thoughts or speech is a common symptom in schizophrenia, can you give an example of the defendant's disorganized thoughts and why you determined it as disorganized?
His speech was so terse at the time that I was seeing him that his speech was not disorganized. It was too brief. The sentences were so brief. And it took so many efforts to get information from him that it was not. There was no... You need to produce some speech, a paragraph at that time to say that it's disorganized. He did not do that. It's his writing. Both is writing in the notebook that are psychotic and disorganized. While they're written in English, you read them. I had to read them a few times and go over it and ask him. The thought process is disorganized, not the actual putting the words or the letters on a page. Disorganization as a thought process is reflected in language and is writing.
Are you using actual quotes from the defendant, or are you paraphrasing in your report? Wouldn't it be beneficial to write down exact quotes directly after the defendant states it to ensure accuracy when writing your report?
When I was taking the notes while evaluating him, I put quotes. When asking the question of him, as I stated, I took over each question, I had to go over and probe again and again and again. And at that time, when I left the room, so he will repeat, I will go, and the same phrase, I went at it several times. What did you mean when you say? So the phrases stuck in my mind. And I wrote them down as a quote. Is it possible that among the 28.5 hours, sometimes I put the quote not at the end of the sentence? It is possible, but by and large, these were words that he told me.
Why wasn't it important to take detailed notes, especially in a case such as this? Is it your normal practice to use your memory for what every patient says instead of taking detailed notes?
So in common practice, in people with schizophrenia, as I said, we do not might jot a few words, but we do not take notes. It's the most important thing to be totally focused on the person at the time. Taking notes can inhibit, in my clinical experience, I might write a word or two that I might want to come back to, check later on.
And the last question, was Mr. Holmes more verbal during your last two interviews compared to the first two?
Yes, and I noted it in my notes and in the report, and I noted in Mr. Reed's evaluation, 2 years later, different, more verbal, more responsive, there's no question about it. Yes, antipsychotics in a limited setting, limited interaction with people, and repeating the same information again and again and again has an effect on him.
Are there any follow-up questions, Mr. King?
Yes, Your Honor, very few. with you were asked about how you ruled out various disorders, autism spectrum disorder. There was one other, and then there was narcissism. And I don't think you addressed narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. How did you rule out that disorder?
Just by all the information that I had available to me, I did not consider that it fits the narcissistic, the important, of self, that everything has to serve me as the main feature, persistent features of his personality.
You were asked about manipulation and malingering. Is there any indication, according to you or any of the other mental health professionals, both psychiatrists who interviewed him and psychologists that administered testing to test for malingering, that Mr. Holmes is in any way malingering his symptoms or manipulating his symptoms to appear mentally ill?
No.
You were asked about being guarded. Is being guarded part of his mental illness?
Yes.
In the case of this crime, did the crime cause the psychosis, or did the psychosis, in your opinion, clearly precede and cause the crime?
The latter.
I think you said, and I may be wrong, that you wrote your first report in February of 2013. Is that true?
No. I think, wait.
Write your first report.
June 17, 2013.
Last question, believe it or not, for me. You talked about delusions and not being able to separate the delusion from the person. How ultimately did the delusion affect Mr. Holmes' life and the circumstance of this case?
So all of the goal-directed behavior toward accomplishing the mission was the delusion. So the delusion, his beliefs, were an integral part, was the part that is propelled to the planning and execution of the crime.
I don't have any other questions.
Mr. Brucker, do you have any follow-up questions?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. A couple things. Doctor, you have repeated here that it is not your practice to take notes at the first interview. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And in part, that's because, as you testified in the 2009 case, the Billiot case we've talked about, it is that your common practice and the practice of those at your clinic to videotape, as you did in the Billiot case, the first interview, correct?
Research, not clinical.
Let me read
Make
this.
a clear separation between clinical practice and research. And I've made it in the court that in research we videotape.
This was the case of Mr. Billiot, who was a criminal defendant, correct?
Yeah, this was decided by everybody there, all those who testified or videotaping, and what I said, that I'm experiencing videotaping people with schizophrenia and that I'm delighted to do that.
So it says, I applied the same standard that I apply to an evaluation of any new patient that I see. I review the records carefully. I present for myself a timeline that includes what are the most common features that are identified by mental health professionals and by staff members at the facility. I review all of this, and then I conduct an interview. Commonly, I videotape my interviews, and I was delighted that this was done in this case. And then you go on to say, so it is the records that I review, the interview that I commonly review again, and provide a summary in the form of a letter or a report. Do you remember testifying to that?
Yes.
Thank you. You also had said in response to a question about why would this guy go to such lengths to armor himself if he didn't care about his own life. He thought his life was valueless, and he was suicidal. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And your answer was that he told you that he was afraid to die. Do you recall that?
Yes.
You'll also recall that on page 6 of your notes from the May 2nd, 2013 visit, he indicated to you that he was ready to die.
At times he did.
Okay.
It's
now,
not something that he had a very clear. Dealing with death is difficult.
This gets us to the malingering discussion that people ask. You would agree with me that the malingering tests and the validation tests test for malingering and validation only on those tests and those questions, correct?
Yes.
In fact, with those malingering tests that say he's not malingering and he's giving valid responses and effort on those tests, what they can't do is they can't keep him from telling you it was a call for action, disavowing that statement to Dr. Metzner, never bringing it up to Dr. Reed, and then repeating it again with you in November of 2014, correct?
Yes, but
So the answer is he can pass multiple malingering and validity tests and yet still give answers inconsistent with one another about just the same set of words over that same period of time. You'd agree with that?
no, because the words that he provided to other professionals are similar. I mean, it didn't provide to other professionals the idea that I was just sitting in front of the television and I had this wonderful idea. He was telling them about a mission, about that he had to accomplish. So if he used with me the word call for action and he didn't use it with them, it's very similar, the words.
No, doctor. I'm referring to the part of Dr. Metzner's detailed 120-page report where he says he specifically asked the defendant if he ever used the phrase a call for action, and he said no.
I know.
Okay.
I know that.
Thank you. And just to be clear, because there's been a couple questions about this, it's your understanding of Colorado law from having reviewed it really just for this case, right?
Correct.
That having mental illness, even serious mental illness, is just simply not enough for insanity, correct?
Correct.
In fact, you'd also agree that the law in Colorado says irresistible impulse or that sort of lack of control, that too is not the standard for sanity in the state of Colorado.
Correct.
And it hasn't been since before you were a psychiatrist. Did you know that?
Yes.
There was something that was asked about violence and schizophrenic, and you had said, and I think you had agreed with the juror who asked the question about the majority of schizophrenics, and I think it's the vast majority, don't commit crimes. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
In fact, it's the opposite. Most schizophrenics are more likely to be victims of crimes than perpetrators of crimes. You'd agree with
Objection
that?
to relevance.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
Yes.
The interview that was asked about at Iowa for grad school, that took place prior to the interviews with the professors at CU who accepted him into the program?
I don't recall the exact date, but it is possible if you say so.
You had commented on what you believe to be the reasons why you differ from Drs. Metzner and Dr. Reed on their finding of sanity. And you had said they placed a great deal of emphasis on the planning. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you remember from the reports that there are a significant number of other points, including ones such as the defendant, immediately after his arrest, being taken through Aurora Police Department and expressing some concern by way of question that a child was hurt. Do you recall that?
Yes.
This is also something not explored in your notes or your report. You'd agree?
I did talk to him about, and it's in the notebook, there is a note about children.
You're going to agree with me if I tell you, having gone through your report a gazillion times.
Yeah, in the report it's not, in the notebook.
And in your notes leading up to the report, there just simply isn't any reference to killing children at all. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
You also talked about the differing styles in questioning patients. You would agree that perhaps one of the reasons for the differing styles is less gender and more training, specifically that Drs. Metzner and Reed are forensically trained, correct?
it might be, although I believe that maybe not in the weight of the report, but in the type of questions that asked, of going through the details, state of mind, everything that is asked by forensic, I've asked, perhaps less in an interrogating manner.
And you'd agree that they have more experience interviewing murderers than you do?
Yes.
You also, I just want to confirm this, you, in your decision-making, in part about not doing a video, is you were concerned about the burden on the jury of watching it?
No, that was not a major concern. It's just that now, going through it and knowing that I didn't know at the time that Dr. Reed will, do 23 hours of videotaping. The major aspect was my impression or thought that from the information that I gathered about him before, that I will be able to get more information from him without a videotaping.
Two last questions, all about that antipsychotic he refused to take from Drs. Fenton and Feinstein. That portion you just testified to where you discussed his reasons why he wouldn't take it, you'd agree, again, not in your report, correct?
If you went through the report carefully, it's in my note about the antipsychotic, the notes on which the report was based, and I said repeatedly that my report does not include question, answer. It's a summary to convey the major points that led me to conclude opinion about Mr. Holmes.
And finally, you would agree that in Dr. Woodcock's notes, 4 days after the shooting, the defendant, according to those notes, indicated to him that he didn't take the antipsychotic because it would have prevented him from carrying out his desire to kill people.
After he has done it, not when he was before that, when he was still seeking out help with Dr. Fenton. It's a different period in his psychotic process. We're talking several months before that.
So the answer to the question is yes, that's what he told Dr. Woodcock?
Yes.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
No further questions, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you.
May this witness be released from our subpoena?
Yes, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No, sir.
All right, doctor, thank you.
Thank you.
Would counsel please approach Mr. King and Mr. Brucker so that we can talk about scheduling for just a moment? All right, members of the jury, it's 4:25. I'm going to go ahead and adjourn for the day. I'm sure you won't mind that. I see some of you seem happy and relieved with that, and so we'll go ahead and do that for today. Please make sure that you abide by all my admonishments overnight. I know that you know them by heart, and I'm going to repeat them to you tomorrow probably before the weekend, but please make sure that you comply with every single one of them. They're all extremely important. And then get some rest tonight, and we'll plan to see you tomorrow morning. Let's plan on letting you sleep in a little bit tomorrow morning, all right? So how about if you come in at 9 tomorrow? Is that good with everyone? Yeah. All right, let's have you in at 9 tomorrow. You can get a little more sleep. So get here a little bit before then, 8:45, to make sure you're all here, and we can start at 9. All right? Get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you. Thank you, Sheriff. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom now. What I propose is that we take a break. I need to give my court reporter a break. We only took a 5-minute break earlier, so let's take about a 15-minute break, 10 or 15-minute break. And then when I come back out, I can go over the Curtis advisement again with Mr. Holmes, and I can question him about that, and then we can adjourn for the day. And then the plan is tomorrow morning, Mr. King, you would call, the defense would call Mr. Gongblack, and then play 2 videos that are approximately 45 minutes in length.
And Judge, I forgot one thing, and that is we also need to publish the jail writings to the jury, if that would be our request.
Okay, remind me tomorrow, will you please?
Yes, sir.
That's D-TR-94.
Yes,
I'll
Your
leave
Honor.
myself a note here.
And we're just asking you to do it in the manner that we've done with other exhibits. We have copies to pass out to the jurors if the court would just give them a period of time to go over it.
I will do that. It sounds like the prosecution may not have much of a rebuttal case, if any, and whatever rebuttal case the prosecution has will be completed tomorrow, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, and so then what I would propose is that we let the jury go home at that point tomorrow, and we can talk about instructions, finish up the instructions. I don't think that's going to take too long, at least that's my thought. And then we can talk a little bit about the issue of opening statements in each phase of the sentencing hearing. If there is a sentencing hearing, you can provide me the authority, Ms. Nelson, that you want to provide me with. And then at that point, I would let you go home and start preparing for closing arguments. At the joint request of the parties, I have allowed the closing arguments to remain set on Tuesday, July 14. That allows everyone to prepare for closings, to get whatever demonstratives they need to get, and then we can proceed with closings on Tuesday. As I mentioned to Mr. Brockler and Mr. King here at the bench during our bench conference, on Tuesday we would have to start later because we have 4 or 5 jury panels coming in for other cases, and we don't have enough space or enough courtrooms to do that, and to also start closings in this case at 9. So we would start at approximately 11:15, and I would tell the jury to eat lunch before they get here, and then the plan would be that I would go over the instructions and 5 of the verdict forms, the sample verdict forms, first thing. That would take about an hour probably. Then we would take a break, maybe a 15-minute break. Then the prosecution would do its opening closing argument. Then we would take a break, probably a 15-minute break. Then the defense would do its closing argument, and then we would take a break, probably a 15-minute break, and then the prosecution would do its rebuttal closing argument. And then at that point, I would still have more remarks for the jury in terms of who are the alternates and who are the deliberating jurors. And maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion about that tomorrow. I looked at the statute last night, and the statute says that in a case like this one, at the time that the jury goes to deliberate, the alternates have to be sequestered. It's an unusual requirement. I'm not sure why that's required, but that's what the statute says. I read that to mean that I have to keep them here in another place. And I'll tell you that what I plan to do is have them kept in a location that is within the courthouse, but far away from this floor and this area, so that there's no contact between the deliberating jurors and the alternate jurors. And in fact, the plan is to avoid even having them park in the same area so as to avoid all contact. So that's how we would proceed. And then at the end of the day, I mean, they would just sit there in the room. It would be a large room because they're going to be there for whenever the deliberating jurors are deliberating. At the end of the day, when the deliberating jurors go home, then we would tell the alternate jurors to go home as well. I would give them the same advisements that I've been giving them throughout in terms of the alternate jurors, and we would proceed in that fashion. That's how I understand the statute. So if anyone disagrees with that, then please let me know by no later than tomorrow. All right, let's go ahead and take a 10 or 15-minute break, and then we'll proceed with the Curtis advisement, okay? All right, the court will be in recess. Thanks.